Hello and welcome back to the weekly ENGAGE Dialogue. My name is Phương Anh from the DAV, and the ENGAGE Research Project is hosted by the CAST EU, DAV, and AVI. So each week we have the talk show from each member from the three clusters that we currently holding, which are security, sustainable development, and connectivity clusters. We have esteemed and distinguished researchers from ASEAN and EU to form a network of research. And today we have Zach Paikin from the security cluster. Zach, can you turn on the camera and say hi to the audience?
Hi, everyone. Good morning from Toronto, and good afternoon or good evening to the rest of you.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for bearing with us despite the time difference. So Zachary Paikin, he's the researcher at the EU Foreign Policy Unit at the Center for European Policy Studies. He is also a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Peace, Diplomacy in Toronto, and a senior visiting fellow at the Global Policy Institute in London. His academic research has focused on great power relations, Russian foreign policy, and the future of international order. And you can, I guess, as you can see, his publication almost everywhere, from the distinguished think tanks like the European Council on Foreign Relations, as well as CAS and other forms of social media platforms. Sorry. So can you tell us a little bit about your research interest?
Sure. Well, I did my PhD a few years ago at the University of Kent in the UK, and I worked mostly on English school theory and how the English School of International Relations should conceive of the so-called liberal international order. Because this was this is a term still that is very much contested, and which a lot of people have struggled to grasp, and which people sort of throw around a little bit too liberally, no pun intended, or perhaps pun intended. I think that there's absolutely room to theorize upon, where the liberal international order is situated vis-a-vis the more established theoretical concepts of international order more broadly and international society, which is a key concept in the English School of International Relations. So I did that in my PhD thesis, and then used Russia and post-Cold War great power relations as sort of a case study illustrating the consequences, basically, of normative contestation for the future of the liberal international order. So that was my core research interest over the past several years. And now, since I've joined the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, I've been working on a variety of different EU foreign policy related issues. My expertise, as I mentioned before, is mostly in Russia and Russian foreign policy. And right now, there's certainly not a dull time to be studying Russia. But I've also been involved on a few other fronts as well. I'm involved in a project called Joint, which is a Horizon 2020 project run by the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. And it's a consortium of many different partners, and we're looking at how to create a more joined up EU foreign policy in a world that is framed by internal EU contestation, as well as regional fragmentation and multipolar competition.
Right, so I can see that not just great power, not just major power countries, but also like major international cooperation as a center of your research interest as well. So I guess that's why we are picking the European and US as our two main subjects for today's talk. So we've picked the topic US pivot to Asia in the context of the current European security crisis. Can you explain a little bit about why you chose that, and maybe what inspired you to do so?
Well, obviously the current European security crisis lays within my area of expertise. But as we've seen for the past several U.S. administrations, we've seen attempts to pivot to Asia. I mean, many people thought that the end of the Cold War meant the end of Europe's centrality in global affairs, and that right then and there should have been a pivot away from Europe, away from the Middle East, towards Asia. Obviously that didn't happen immediately, but we have seen an explicit effort to pivot away under the Obama administration, under the so-called rebalancing or the pivot to Asia, particularly after the George W. Bush administration's freedom agenda, which was highly centered on the Middle East. And after, of course, the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, and which prompted an attempt at a reset in relations between the U.S. and Russia. So all of that was sort of a first attempt, as it were, to pivot towards Asia. And we saw, obviously this continue under the Trump administration, in which, Donald Trump really turned China into public enemy number one to an extent that we had not previously seen in U.S. politics and political discourse, but also listed Russia and China as rival powers in the administration's national security strategy for the first time.
Right.
Officially. So of course, before the Trump administration, there were rising tensions and disagreements between the U.S. and China. There was even, there were even attempts, by the U.S. to balance or hedge, I should say, against the implications of a rising China, including militarily. But still, officially, the dominant position in Washington was, China needs to become a responsible stakeholder in the international order, and we're going to pursue a policy of engagement to try to integrate them into that international order. Of course, there were always going to be flaws in that strategy because China was never going to accept a subordinate or subaltern position in a U.S.-led international order. What Russia and China want is to be treated as equals and to have the same privileges and the same rights that the United States has set in its own example as a great power over the course of the past 30 years. But what we did see under the Trump administration, nonetheless, is that Russia was a much closer second to China than we've seen under the Biden administration, right? I mean, much of what the Trump administration still did was about Russia, right? I mean, the Trump administration, despite all the accusations that, that Trump was a Russian stooge, if you actually look at the policy of his administration rather than his own tweets and his own, corporate history, et cetera, you'll see that the Trump administration actually got tough on Russia in some significant ways, right? I mean, getting much more involved in bombing Syria, for example, and providing lethal aid to the Ukrainians and encouraging European partners to spend more on their militaries, in pulling out of the INF agreement, which is, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, and also the Open Skies Agreement, driving a hard bargain on renegotiating the New START strategic weapons nuclear agreement. So all of these instances demonstrate the extent to which the Trump administration was not a friend to Russian interests at all and drove a hard bargain. And of course, this was during Russiagate, et cetera. Russia very much remained at the center of U.S. attention. It's only under the Biden administration, I think, that we've really seen Biden try to complete this pivot more fully and to make Russia a much more distant second in U.S. grand strategy behind China. But of course, the problem is Russia still remains a great power today. It retains, the ability to project power because of its geographic location into many different theaters, right, into Eastern Europe, the South Caucasus, the Middle East, Central Asia, and even to a limited extent, but still in East Asia. And so, as much as you would like to ignore Russia, that's not possible. They remain a great power. They will remain a great power for decades to come. Let's not forget. And if you want a stable and predictable relationship with Russia, as the Biden administration has said, that's going to come at a cost. And I think Russia is making what that cost is quite clear right now.
Right, I have to agree with you there. Even though we see that this discontinued pivot to Asia, I wouldn't say discontinued, but not as much as fervent as we see in the last administration. But we can still see that Russia is capable of and will have the will to expand or at least present its presence in the region or even in the Indo-Pacific region, right? So we can see that the U.S. pivot to Asia is something that is definitely on the agenda of the Biden administration. But why put it in a context of the current European security crisis? Can you give us a little bit update on the current crisis?
For sure. So basically, this crisis has been 30 years in the making. So it's obviously, it was always going to be a question, I think, of when and not about what, because Russia's place in the European security order was unresolved at the end of the Cold War. Basically, much of the rest of Europe was invited to join Western security and political and economic institutions like NATO and the European Union. And Russia was not. And Russia was expected to liberalize. And basically become a liberal democracy and a fully fledged market economy without the promise of the benefits that come with integrating fully into Western institutions. That was, unfortunately never on the table for them. It was decided very early on in the post-Cold War era that Russia would not be invited to join the EU, that it just would not be able to meet the EU acquis, it's too big, etc. And despite the fact that both President Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin both raised the idea of Russia joining NATO, that never really went anywhere. NATO remains an organization that is based on U.S. leadership, and admitting a power as significant as Russia into NATO's ranks would obviously change, the fundamental dynamics and structure of NATO to too great an extent. So, we've seen the security crisis elevate over the course of many different post-Cold War events. but in particular, relations between Russia and the West have deteriorated since 2014 with the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, which Russians believe was effectively a Western-backed extra-constitutional coup to remove a democratically elected president and impose an ultra-nationalist regime in its place, bent on separating the Ukrainian people from their true desire to be united with Russia, and bringing Ukraine into Western institutions at Russia's expense in order to keep Russia, weak. Effectively. And so, over the course of the past 8 years, we've seen that significant deterioration of relations. Russia has, engaged in much disruptive behavior vis-a-vis the West, but ultimately these have been half measures. And so I think that part of the reason why we're seeing the escalation right now is because 8 years of what Russia perceives as half measures have not succeeded in Russia being able to achieve its core goal, which is to prevent Ukraine from joining the West. Russia wants to, ensure that Ukraine remains within its so-called sphere of privileged interests, or maybe is neutral at best, or Russia can perhaps, retain some sort of veto over Ukraine's orientation. And that's something that Western countries, as a matter of principle, completely reject. So we're sort of at an impasse right now, and I don't know how we're going to find language that can satisfy all parties. Maybe we could talk about some sort of moratorium on NATO expansion, but as of right now, it doesn't look like, as far as we can tell, that's being discussed at an active level, at least at the high diplomatic table. So that's what's going on right now. And obviously, why is this connected to the pivot to Asia? Because obviously, if there is a military conflagration on the European continent,
right.
The U.S. will have to reinforce its military presence on the European continent. There's no other option. I mean, I suppose the only other option is you have like another East of Suez moment in which basically the U.S. has a decisive moment in history and says, sorry, Europe, you're on your own. Our interests are elsewhere. But I highly doubt that the U.S. would do that. They would have to reinforce the presence in Europe, and that would, of course, come at the expense of any pivot to Asia.
The chances are low. So this escalation, would you say that it would erupt into a war, or would if I put it in Fukuyama words, at the end of the history has ended, and now diplomatic result will prevail?
Yeah, history is definitely back. That's for sure. Is a war likely? I'm increasingly worried. For the reasons that I just mentioned, which is that, as wonderful as it would be to have a dialogue on strategic stability, on the placement of conventional forces and missile placement and things like that, and on the rules concerning cyber, all these things that sort of were discussed, at the Geneva meeting between President Joe Biden and President Vladimir Putin back in June of last year. That's all great. And in another world, I'm sure that Russia would have considered that to be a significant win. But the fact is that Russia has, upped the ante so much at this point that no longer appears to be a win. As much as they would like, are happy to discuss those strategic stability issues, they also want their core security guarantees addressed. And those are core political issues concerning the architecture of the European continent, right? It concerns, basically at the end of the day, what place Russia is accorded in Europe. Does it have a veto, and are its security interests treated seriously, right? Because for much of the post-Cold War era, irrespective of what Russia communicated to the West in terms of its desired security outcomes, the West was happy to have dialogue with Russia and to talk to them, but at the end of the day, the West was going to do what the West was going to do. They were going to act unilaterally. They weren't going to let Russia get in the way. And I think that's been very clear ever since, NATO intervened in the disintegrating Yugoslavia in 1999, right? I mean, there was dialogue. As some people say, Russia was invited to the hors d'oeuvres, but ultimately they weren't invited to the dinner. Because once you agree a policy among all these different NATO members, it becomes very difficult at that point to alter it in any significant fashion from a bargaining perspective, when you have a discussion between NATO and Russia. So that's going to have to be overcome somehow. I don't know how, but we need to be placed somehow on a track to a more inclusive and more cooperative security arrangement in Europe over the years to come. And it's going to take time to get there. Those agreements, those arrangements, take months, if not years, to be discussed. Right. But there needs to be some sort of agreement right now that can de-escalate tensions, over the next few weeks, so that we don't end up with a security situation that's far worse for all parties, right? For all parties, because everyone will emerge as a loser from a war over Ukraine, except for China. right? The U.S. will have to reinforce its presence in Europe at the expense of its pivot to Asia, and the generational challenge, is China. It's not Russia. Even though Russia remains a great power, will retain the ability to keep the U.S. attention. The fact is that in 20 years, Asia is going to represent half of global GDP, and Europe is going to represent 10% of global GDP. So, it just does not make the same sense for the U.S. to remain as invested in Europe today as it was, during the Cold War. What the U.S. needs is a strong and independent Europe that can help it in its contest with China, assuming that it does want to pursue a contest with China. And I think it does, because, that's one of the few things on which there is bipartisan agreement in Washington right now, is the need to have this, generational struggle with China. So the U.S. would emerge as a loser vis-a-vis, in the context of a conflict with Russia. Russia, obviously, whatever, they may or may not succeed in their strategic goal in bringing Ukraine back into their orbit. There's no guarantee, but they would face economic sanctions, which they can weather, but which are not ideal. Europe, of course, would have its security situation, significantly worsened on its own frontier. Ukraine would be invaded and would be dismembered. The only winner, as I mentioned, is basically China, which just has to sit back and watch. All these people who sort of say that, China will jump on the opportunity if Russia invades Ukraine to invade Taiwan. I don't know about that. The China-Taiwan issue far precedes the Russia-Ukraine issue by several decades. It operates, as many other analysts have said, according to its own dynamics. And as I just mentioned, all China really has to do is sit back and watch and play the long game, and position itself as a more responsible and peaceful player in the international order, rather than these sort of zero-sum policies between the U.S. and Russia, which clearly, if there is a war, will have demonstrated that they have not succeeded in building a more stable and secure international order for all.
Exactly. So given the context, do you think, is there a way for the EU country to sort of be united or cooperated to work against a shared goal?
Well, but we've seen EU disunity be an important feature over the course of the past several years, and part of that is just because the 27 different EU members have such fundamentally different histories and security perceptions vis-a-vis Russia. There's just no way, based on shared historical memory, that someone in Spain is going to view Russia the same way, as someone in Poland. That makes things just very difficult. And it has not been aided by the way that certain governments have behaved. On all sides. I think we've seen France and Germany not consult enough with their other European partners before attempting a renewed dialogue with Russia, and therefore there's been a lot of lost trust. Right, Emmanuel Macron has really proceeded unilaterally, or at least did proceed unilaterally back in 2019 to try to relaunch dialogue and rapprochement with Russia, which has not necessarily borne fruit. Germany, even today under its new chancellor Olaf Scholz, has struggled to put together a coherent position on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and respond to the concerns of Central and European countries. But at the same time, many of the more hawkish Central and European countries have also acted unilaterally and have adopted the mistaken idea that basically we can, pressure Russia and tell Russia that it needs to change. And that basically we have to say, oh, there's no business as usual until Russia changes its behavior and becomes a good state. That's just not going to happen either. That's not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. There's a lot of blame to go around among all the 27 EU members. I think you might see unity on some fronts. You have seen unity on the imposition of sanctions, which have to be renewed by the European Council every 6 months. So we've seen that since the 2014 Euromaidan revolution. A lot of people did not expect that because there are many EU member states who have an interest in good relations with Russia, either diplomatically or economically. And so many people thought that, just for pragmatic reasons, the sanctions, after the 2014 crisis would be lifted within a few short years. We have not seen that happen. And partly that's because there's so many divisions among EU member states amid the crises of the mid-2010s that, unity vis-a-vis Russia was one of the few examples of EU unity. So it became sort of unity for the cause of unity itself, rather than the actual content of the policy and whether the policy itself was working. And unfortunately, 8 years of sanctions have not succeeded in changing Russia's foreign policy behavior, because Russia has number one, used the opportunity somewhat to build up its foreign currency reserves and sanction-proof its economy, but also because Russia just knows full well that as much as sanctions hurt, and have resulted in a degree of economic stagnation. Most of the world's GDP is not sanctioning Russia. Japan imposed very limited sanctions. Other countries like Korea, dynamic economies, India, China, etc. They're not sanctioning Russia, and Russia wants to pursue what it perceives as its core security interests. And as we've seen throughout history, and this was true on the eve of World War I as well. Security interests are more important than economic interests. Yes, the world is more integrated today, than it was back then. We've got integrated supply chains now, but the world was also very integrated on the eve of World War I. And everyone thought, no one was going to risk their economic interests and destroy their own economies by going to war. Well, the war happened nonetheless. And let's remember that Russia and the EU, they don't, despite the fact that the EU remains as a collective actor, Russia's most important trading partner, it's not a deeply integrated relationship in terms of, value and supply chains, right? Russia provides Europe with natural resources. Europe provides Russia with finished goods, but that's not a very deeply integrated relationship. So even there, if you would assume that economic integration would act as a coolant on a potential war, that doesn't necessarily play out logically in this case either. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, to be worried right now.
Right, because we can see that the economic link is not exactly co-interdependent. So they can easily be replaced when it comes to security, which is the utmost priority, right? So let's circle back to the US pivot to the Asia. So we can see that Russia, obviously, what we've been talking about is that Russia is gonna be a challenge, or at least something that the US need to deal with or settle with before they want to successfully pivot to Asia. So what do you think about the accommodation that the US would need with Russia to pivot to Asia, and what would the price of such accommodation be?
Well, so I'm very worried at this point that such an accommodation is no longer possible simply because there's not enough mutual trust, right? We've seen trust between the parties decline repeatedly over the course of the post-Cold War era. And it's very hard to build that back, right? It's much easier to lose trust than it is to build trust, and it's going to be a long way back. And at this point in time, the US, for whatever reason, has decided that it wants to have an adversarial relationship with both Russia and China at the same time, right? Even the Biden administration, which came out, in the spring of last year, explicitly in favor of a stable and predictable relationship with Russia, well, it was still a limited attempt to produce a stable and predictable relationship. The logic basically was, we're going to disagree on most things, but let's find a few things we can talk about, like strategic stability and cyber issues, and sort of make it a more predictable adversarial relationship, but still an adversarial relationship. We acknowledge the relationship is going to be adversarial for the foreseeable future. Let's just make it a little bit more predictable, right? But that's very different from conducting what people call a reverse Kissinger, right? Which is to rip Russia away from China, to turn Russia into more of a friend of the West, to be able to focus on China. And that's just not possible right now, not only because there's not enough trust between Russia and the West, and because Russia firmly believes at this point in time, this isn't just so they can score propaganda points at home, but it certainly does help them to do that. It's also because, the Russian elite and much of the Russian population truly believes that the West does not have their core interests at heart, that they're unilateral, that they want Russia to be weak, etc. And so there's just not enough, shared trust there. But beyond that, China is a rising power, and Russia has a very long border with China. And Russia needs to maintain good relations with China one way or another. Even after Vladimir Putin is no longer president of Russia, his successor, even if his successor wants to, return to good relations with the West, that doesn't mean that Russia will, become an enemy of China. That's just not possible right now. Russia will need to maintain, good relations for security reasons, for economic reasons, etc. In fact, what we're seeing right now in this current crisis is that Russia is only capable of addressing its security interests in Europe as effectively as it is because it has largely desecuritized its relationship with China, and it can move troops out of its eastern zone into Western Russia, in order to be able to apply greater pressure on Ukraine and on the West, right? So that the logic underpinning that Russia-China relationship, I think, is going to remain in place for a long time. And I don't think that the Eastern Military District of Russia has seen as few troops, as it has right now in a very, very long time. So that dynamic is very much going to remain there. I think we need to be very cautious about the extent to which we can actually rip Russia away from China. Maybe over the very long term, if China insists on driving a really hard bargain with Russia on several fronts, if it really wants to drive a hard bargain on natural resources, if it starts to behave in a less restrained fashion in Central Asia, which we didn't see recently, by the way. There was just a crisis, in Kazakhstan, and everyone has been saying for the past several years, the previous division of labor in which Russia is responsible for, security and China is responsible for the economy, that no longer holds. China's playing a greater security role in the region. Well, China played a very cautious and restrained role, and it's pretty clear that Russia's, security role in the region has very much been bolstered there, as well, right? So, for now, the fundamentals of the relationship between Russia and China remain sound. But if that changes over the long run, then maybe Russia starts to reevaluate its relationship. But that's really a very long-term issue. In the meantime, we've seen the West, stick to its guns on its question of its values, and principles, and that's perfectly fine. If you want to say, Ukraine, is a sovereign state, and the way that we interpret sovereignty is that, Ukraine has the right to choose to join the West, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a disputed, a definition of sovereignty. As far as I'm concerned, we should be defending Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, and its right to live within its, internationally recognized borders. That's what I think sovereignty and independence means. I don't think it means you have the right to join whatever military alliance you want. But if we insist nonetheless on this principle of Ukraine has the right to join the West, etc., well, then the price of sticking to our guns on those principles is an adversarial relationship with Russia. That's just the reality. And so now we just have to find a way to manage a dual adversarial relationship with Russia and China at the same time. I don't think it's in our interest, but I don't see much of a way out of it for the foreseeable future. It's going to be a long road back to just a more cooperative framework in Europe, which is not, the same thing, as getting Russia to pivot fully away from China. And I should add one more thing, which is one reason why we should not be able to expect a full pivot away from China, is that Russia's strategy vis-a-vis Europe for the longest time, going back to the time of the Soviet Union as well, and even, pre-communist times, has been to have a buffer space in Europe vis-a-vis Western powers, right? And there are buffer states in Europe that could play that role for Russia, right? Belarus certainly, and Russia would like Ukraine to play that role as well. That doesn't exist, in the case of the Russia-China relationship. Russia shares a direct border with China that is very, very long. So the geography is also an inhibiting factor there.
They're going to be neighbors for centuries to come. So I totally agree that separating China and Russia is clearly impossible. But I'm curious, and maybe I'm just trying to pick your brain here, but do you think that in the near future, there is the possibility that Russia and China could form, I don't know, maybe an alliance? An alliance. Yeah, because we can see that their interests there's some convergence on their interests to some certain extent. But do you see the future where Russia and China can be allies?
Well, the word alliance has been thrown around in some corners. I even think that Vladimir Putin himself mentioned it once, like that the relationship was an alliance in basically every sense of the term. But, in terms of what an alliance actually means, that each side is prepared to come to the defense of the other, I don't see that happening unless there's a fundamental international crisis in which, both end up in a military conflict with the West at the same time. That could result in an alliance. But, barring that, I think that the status quo suits both parties, much better, right? I mean, it's a strategic partnership. It's an entente. It gives, both parties a degree of flexibility and maneuverability in their relationship with each other, right? Which means that they're never against each other, but they're not always with each other. And there are things on which they disagree, right? I mean, Russia has, great historic relations, with Vietnam and with India, and China, as well would like to, have good relations with Ukraine, for the reasons related to its own Belt and Road Initiative. So, they each are entitled to their own foreign policies. And it's clearly a convergence, I think, of strategic interests right now. And I think that degree of maneuverability, certainly suits both parties because they get to benefit from sort of their collective weight when acting together in international affairs. But nonetheless, they get to retain their positions as well as independent great powers. And since they are great powers, they have their own philosophies, their own conceptions of international order, which are not 100% identical, even though they're both, increasingly authoritarian states, and they, believe in multipolarity, and they, are opposed to U.S. hegemony. On the surface, there's a lot of agreement, but if you get into the detail, the conceptions of international order are not, necessarily identical. And in terms of military doctrine as well, right? I mean, great powers have their own military doctrine, and the way that we view alliances in the West, right, is that you've basically got, one dominant power like the United States, and then a series of subordinate powers like the other NATO members, which rely on military interoperability, et cetera. And there is some of that, as far as I understand. I'm not a military expert, but as far as I understand, there is a degree of that in the Sino-Russian relationship. But nonetheless, each side would like to retain, their own grand strategic doctrines as well.
Thank you. Well, I would say that's very good timing, because we've covered almost everything that we need to know within the topic in just 30 minutes. So I would say that is very, very impressive. So I've been scouring the audience questions, and there's one that has come up. It's from a DAV student, though. She was wondering, and it is not strictly related to our topic today, but she has picked up that you was a speechwriter at the Canada's permanent mission to the UN, and she was wondering if you have some interesting story to share with us while you were there.
Okay, well, I was actually, thank you very much for the question. I was based remotely, so I was not actually in New York, because this was during our campaign for a seat on the UN Security Council, and then this took place, during the pandemic. The vote was in June of 2020. So I was based remotely in Toronto and not in New York, and I was a consultant. It was more of an ad hoc role, so I didn't get to be too involved. It was more of a minor role, so I don't have any exciting stories to share, unfortunately. But I think it's unfortunate that we were not successful in our campaign, despite great efforts from our diplomats.
Well, I think working within that position, then no role is a minor, so don't worry about that. Okay, so thank you so much for spending time with us today, and to the audience, please tune in next week on Friday again, so that we have the next cluster presenting with a speaker. Thank you, Zach, and hopefully that we can see you on the show again another time, because I had such a great time talking to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Come in.
Great, thank you, and goodbye.